The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was built to make every species feel small, and it succeeded beautifully at that purpose every single day of the year. Columns of living crystal rose from the floor and disappeared into a ceiling so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it, and the air hummed with the quiet vibrations of 100 different translation devices working at once to turn 100 different languages into something everyone could pretend to understand. Ambassador Jonah Moen stood at the speaking platform and looked out across the assembly with the calm expression of a man who had practiced being calm for so long that it had become real, and he folded his hands behind his back and waited for the murmuring to stop. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Concord for 40 years now, which was barely a heartbeat in the memory of species that lived for centuries. And in those 40 years, the humans had done exactly what everyone expected them to do. They had spread to a handful of colony worlds, built farms and cities and schools, argued among themselves constantly, and generally behaved like the noisy, short-lived creatures the rest of the galaxy believed them to be. They were not taken seriously, and they knew it, and knowing it was the thing that burned the most. The Concord archivist, a thin and ancient creature called a Pelori, whose skin looked like old paper stretched over wire, stood at his podium and read from the cultural registry in his dry and crackling voice. Species 4417, known as humanity. Origin world designated Earth. Symbolic animal as assigned by the Concord Biological Survey. The honey badger. A small omnivorous mammal native to multiple continents on the origin world, known for aggressive territorial behavior disproportionate to its physical size. Laughter rippled through the assembly hall. Not loud, not cruel, but the kind of quiet amusement that powerful beings allowed themselves when they looked at something they considered beneath their attention. Jonah Moen did not smile, and he did not frown, and he did not react at all, which was its own kind of statement. In the upper galleries, Warden Corvette San watched the human ambassador with the patient attention of a predator who was not yet hungry, but liked to keep track of where the small animals were. Corvette was Dralith, 9 feet of dense muscle and bio-armored scales that shifted color with his mood, dark blue when calm and bright red when angry, though very few beings had ever seen him angry, because most problems were solved long before he needed to feel anything at all. He had been warden of the Concord for over 200 years, which meant he was the one they sent when a species needed to be reminded of its place. And in 200 years, he had never failed at that task, not once, not ever. He had broken the Verith Rebellion in 6 days, had pacified the Orlan cluster without firing a shot, had stood on the bridges of burning warships, and watched civilizations fold themselves into submission at the sight of his fleet. And he had done all of it with the absolute certainty that order required strength, and strength required someone willing to use it. He looked down at the small human standing at the speaking platform and felt nothing in particular, the way a mountain feels nothing about the wind. Jonah Moen began to speak, and his voice carried through the translation devices in every language at once. The Concord has been very generous with its patience toward humanity, and we are grateful for that patience in the same way that a guest is grateful when the host allows them to sit at the table. But I want to be clear about something today. We are not asking for permission to expand our colonial boundaries. We are informing the Assembly that expansion will occur because our people need room to grow, and we have found worlds that are empty and waiting, and we intend to fill them. The murmuring that followed was different from the laughter. It was sharper, more surprised, the sound of beings who had just heard a small creature growl at them for the first time. Corveth leaned forward in his seat, and his scales shifted just slightly toward a darker shade. After the session ended, Corveth walked the private corridors of the Concord Tower, with 3 members of the Security Council beside him. and he spoke in the low and unhurried voice that everyone who served under him had learned to fear more than shouting. The humans are becoming confident, and confidence in a minor species is a weed that must be pulled before it sets roots, he said, and the council members nodded, because nodding was what you did when the Warden spoke. There is a colony world called Valen's Reach on the edge of their expansion zone. 12,000 settlers, mostly farmers, no military presence worth mentioning. I propose a correction action, something visible enough to remind them, and quiet enough that the assembly can look the other way. The council members exchanged glances, but said nothing, which was the same as saying yes, and Corveth accepted their silence the way he always did, as permission. 3 weeks later, his fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above a small green world, where wheat fields stretched from horizon to horizon, and the air smelled like rain and growing things. On the surface of that world, in one of those wheat fields, a 7-year-old girl named Alara Moen was lying on her back and watching the sky, because the sky on Valen's Reach was her favorite thing in the whole universe. It turned purple at sunset, and sometimes, if you watched long enough, you can see the cargo ships come in from orbit, trailing little lines of fire as they slowed down. She was watching for cargo ships when the sky lit up with something new, bright points of light, appearing one after another, too many and too fast to be cargo ships. And they were not trailing fire, they were trailing something colder and sharper. Ilara sat up in the wheat and stared at the lights, and felt something she had never felt before, a tightness in her chest that was not pain, but was the place where pain would live later. She did not know what the lights were, but she knew they were wrong, and she knew it in the way that children know things, completely and without doubt, and with no words to explain it. Somewhere above her, beyond the atmosphere, Warden Corveth San stood on the bridge of his flagship, and looked down at the little green world and felt nothing at all. He gave the order, and the lights began to fall. The first thing that hit was the sound, not an explosion but a deep, rolling hum that came up through the ground and shook the bones inside the body, and every person on Valen's Reach felt it at the same moment, and every person knew in that moment that the sky was no longer safe. Corveth had planned the operation as a correction, a careful and measured thing. Disable the communication towers first, then the power grid, then the landing pads, and finally move ground forces in to arrest the colonial leadership and broadcast a message that would remind humanity that the Concorde's patience had limits. It was supposed to be clean. It was not clean. The farmers of Valen's Reach did not behave the way minor species were supposed to behave when a warden's fleet appeared above their world, because the farmers of Valen's Reach had not read the manual on how minor species were supposed to behave, and even if they had read it, they would have used it as fuel for their cooking fires. A retired Marine sergeant named Cal Brody heard the first impact from his workshop, where he had been repairing a grain harvester, and within 4 minutes he had pulled his old service rifle from a locked cabinet, and within 10 minutes he had organized 31 volunteers at the edge of town, and within 20 minutes those 31 volunteers had turned the main road into a kill zone, using mining charges and improvised barriers made from harvester parts. Engineers in the colony's power station rigged electromagnetic pulse traps from spare generator components, and fried the navigation systems of the first 3 Drelith dropships that tried to land near the southern fields, sending them spinning into the dirt in clouds of smoke and broken metal. A schoolteacher named Priya Vasht led 40 children and their parents into the old mining tunnels beneath the eastern ridge, and sealed the entrance behind them, and sat in the dark, with her arms around as many of them as she could reach. None of this was supposed to happen, and Corveth stood on his bridge and watched the reports come in with a growing stillness that his officers recognized and feared, the stillness that came before the color change, the shift from blue to something darker. His ground commander reported 7 casualties in the first hour. 7 Dralith soldiers killed by farmers with mining equipment and hunting weapons. And the number was small, but the meaning was enormous, because the number was supposed to be 0. No minor species had ever inflicted casualties during a Warden's pacification action, not in 200 years, not once, and the fact that it had happened here, on this little farm world, with these small and short-lived creatures, was something that Corveth could not accept, because accepting it would mean accepting that he had been wrong about something, and Corveth had not been wrong about anything in a very long time. He gave new orders, and the new orders were not careful, and they were not measured. The bombardment that followed was the kind of thing that the Concord would later describe as regrettable escalation in official documents that were designed to say nothing while filling many pages, and what it actually was, stripped of all the comfortable language, was a warden burning a farming colony to the ground because the farmers had the nerve to fight back. Ambassador Jonah Moen was on the surface when it happened. He had come to visit his brother David's family, to see his niece Ilara, to walk in the wheat fields, and eat food that tasted like home. And he was standing in the town square when the second wave hit. And he did not survive it, and neither did David, and neither did most of the adults in the central settlement. The wheat fields burned, and the smoke rose so high that it could be seen from orbit. And Corveth watched the smoke from his bridge, and told himself that this was what order looked like, and that the cost was acceptable. In the agricultural district on the far side of the colony, Ilara's uncle, David's wife's brother, a quiet mechanic named Thomas Park, grabbed Ilara by the arm and ran. He ran through burning streets and past fallen buildings, and through air that tasted like metal and fire. And he ran until he reached the old seed bunker beneath the agricultural warehouse, a sealed underground room designed to protect genetic samples from radiation and storms. And he opened the heavy door and pushed Ilara inside. "Stay here," he said, and his face was covered in ash and his eyes were red and his hands were shaking, but his voice was steady because he made it steady for her. "Stay here and do not open this door until someone comes for you. Do you understand me?" Ilara nodded, and Thomas looked at her for one more second, and then he closed the door, and the lock engaged with a sound like a heartbeat stopping. And then there was silence. She waited in the dark. She waited for 2 days. The bunker was small and cold and completely black, and there was no sound from the outside because the walls were built to keep everything out. And Ilara sat on the concrete floor with her knees pulled up to her chest, and her arms wrapped around her legs, and she did not cry because crying required a kind of understanding that she did not yet have. She knew something terrible had happened, but she did not yet know what terrible meant. Not fully. Not in the way she would come to know it later. She counted seconds for a while, and then she counted minutes, and then she stopped counting, because the numbers were too big, and they frightened her. On the surface above her, Corveth's forces completed their operation, and the warden himself walked through the ruins of the colony with his hands clasped behind his back, and his scales were calm blue again, and he noted the destruction with the same interest that a gardener might show toward weeds that had been pulled. A Concord relief delegation arrived the next day, medical ships and diplomats and observers, who were there to document the official version of events, which was that the human colonists had provoked the action through illegal weapons development, and that the warden had responded with appropriate force. Corveth stood before the delegation and gestured at the smoking ruins, and said, "This is what happens when a minor species forgets its place. The lesson is painful, but it is necessary, and it will not need to be repeated." They found Ilara on the morning of the 3rd day. A Velithari medic opened the bunker door, and light poured in, and Ilara looked up from the floor where she had been sitting without moving for so long that her legs had gone numb, and she blinked at the light and said nothing. They brought her out into the open air, and she stood in the ashes of her home and looked around at what was left, which was almost nothing. And a Dralith officer, young, barely a century old, wearing the bright insignia of Corveth's personal guard, looked down at the small human child and smiled with amusement, and said, "Do you understand what happened here, little one?" Ilara looked up at him, and her eyes were dry, and her face was still, and her voice, when it came, was so quiet that the translation device almost missed it. "I understand," she said. Across the ruined square, a Velithari diplomat named Saris Own watched the exchange, and felt something cold move through her body. Not sympathy, not pity, but something older and deeper. The instinct that prey animals carry in their blood, the one that tells them when something dangerous is nearby. She opened her personal log that night, and wrote with hands that were not quite steady. The child did not cry, and she did not scream, and she did not ask for her parents, and she did not look away from the destruction around her. Why, she looked at it the way someone memorizes a map, carefully and completely, as if she intended to walk that road again someday. I have lived for 400 years, and I have seen grief in 1,000 forms, and what I saw in that child's eyes was not grief. It was something else entirely, and I do not have a word for it, and I am not certain I want one. Ilara was taken to a refugee transport, and given a blanket and a cup of water, and she held both without using either, and she sat by the window and watched Valen's reach grow smaller as the ship rose into the sky, and she pressed her hand flat against the glass and kept her eyes open until the world disappeared. She was 7 years old, and she had learned something that most species took centuries to learn. She had learned that the universe was not fair, and that powerful beings could destroy everything you loved, and call it order, and walk away without looking back. And she had learned one more thing, important thing, which was that she would never forget. 15 years passed, and the galaxy made the mistake of thinking that 15 years was a long time for a grudge. It was not. In the months after Valen's reach burned, the alien diplomats and intelligence analysts and Concord observers all watched humanity very carefully, waiting for the reaction they expected. The screaming, the protests, the desperate and angry demands for justice that minor species always made when they had been hurt. The kind of noise that was loud and satisfying and ultimately useless, because noise without power is just noise. They waited for the tantrum. The tantrum never came. Instead, something happened that the galaxy had never seen before. Humanity went quiet, and the quiet was so complete and so sudden that it frightened beings who had lived through wars and plagues and the collapse of empires without ever feeling afraid. Earth's fractured nations, which had spent centuries arguing with each other about everything from border lines to the proper way to brew tea, stopped arguing overnight, and the silence of their arguments was louder than any war drum the galaxy had ever heard. The colonial governments, the corporate blocs, the military councils, the scientific academies, all of them turned inward at the same moment like a fist closing, and when they opened again, they were no longer separate fingers, but a single hand, and that hand began to build. They built ships, not the clumsy freight haulers and patched-together exploration vessels that the galaxy was used to seeing with human markings, but something new, something lean and fast and angry in a way that machines should not be able to be angry, but somehow were. They built weapons that the Concord's intelligence services could not identify and could not understand, because humanity had stopped sharing its research with the galactic community and had sealed its borders to outside observers with a politeness so cold it could have frozen starlight. They built alliances, quiet ones, careful ones, reaching out to every species that had ever been stepped on by a warden's boot. And there were more of those species than anyone wanted to admit, and they were all very interested in what the humans had to say. And through all of it, through every ship launched, and every weapon tested, and every alliance forged, humanity never once raised its voice, and the galaxy began to learn a new word, a human word that did not translate well into any other language because no other species had a concept quite like it. The word was grudge. And at the center of all of it, like the quiet eye of a storm that the rest of the world could feel but not see, was Alara Moen. She was 22 years old now, and she had grown into the kind of person who entered a room without making a sound, and left it without anyone noticing she had gone. Except that after she left, everyone in the room felt slightly colder and could not explain why. She worked for Terran Strategic Command as a tactical analyst, which was a title that did not come close to describing what she actually did. And what she actually did was remember things. She remembered every report, every intelligence briefing, every fleet movement, every name of every officer in Corvette's chain of command. And she organized those memories into patterns that other people could not see until she pointed at them, and then they became so obvious that people wondered how they had ever missed them. The alien diplomats who met her at formal functions described her in their private communications with words like polite and composed and well-spoken. And then after a pause, they would add the word unsettling, and they would not be able to explain exactly what they meant by that, except that being in a room with Alara Moen felt like being in a room with something that was waiting. And the not knowing what it was waiting for was the part that made your scales itch. Warden Corvette-san, older now, but still powerful, still feared, still wearing his authority like armor that had never been dented, received regular briefings on human activity, and dismissed them with the casual confidence of someone who had never been wrong. "They are building toys," he told the Concord Security Council during a routine session, leaning back in his massive chair, with his scales a calm and steady blue. "Minor species always build toys after they have been corrected. It makes them feel powerful for a little while, and then they grow tired, and they remember their place, and the toys rust in their hangars." He looked around the table and saw the faces he expected to see, the careful agreement, the quiet nods, the absence of challenge, and he smiled with the satisfaction of someone who owned the room and knew it. "I strode over them once," he said. "They are small creatures with long memories and short lives. They will forget. They always do, because forgetting is what small creatures are built for." But not everyone in the galaxy shared his confidence, and one of those who did not was Saris Own. Saris had risen to become one of the Concord's senior diplomats, a position of considerable influence, and she had used that influence to watch humanity more carefully than anyone else, because she had never forgotten what she saw in a child's eyes on a burned colony world 15 years ago. She arranged to meet Alara at a diplomatic reception on Concord Station, a glittering event full of powerful beings, drinking expensive things and saying nothing of importance. And she found the young human woman standing alone near a viewing window, looking out at the stars with an expression that could have been peace or could have been patience. And from the outside, those two things looked exactly the same. "Commander Moen," Saris said, and her voice was careful, the way you are careful when you reach towards something that might bite. "I wanted to ask you something, if I may. Does humanity seek reconciliation with the Concord, or does it seek something else?" Alara turned from the window and looked at the Velithari diplomat with eyes that were dark and calm and completely unreadable. And she smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and for some reason that smile made Saris more nervous than any threat could have. "Ambassador Own," Alara said, and her voice was soft and friendly and perfectly controlled. "My people have a saying about the honey badger. Do you know what it is?" Saris shook her head. "The honey badger does not forgive," Alara said, still smiling, still warm, still terrifying. "It just waits until it is hungry again." She excused herself politely and walked away into the crowd and disappeared among the taller bodies of alien diplomats, the way a stone disappears into a river, completely and without a ripple. Window for a long time after that, and said nothing to anyone. And when she returned to her quarters, she poured herself a drink and did not touch it, and sat in the dark and thought about honey badgers and patience and the look in a child's eyes. 2 weeks later, in a secured facility deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, the commanding officers of Terran Strategic Command gathered around a table and activated a file that had been in preparation for over a decade. The file was called Operation Long Memory. Alara Moen was assigned as lead strategist, and she accepted the assignment with a nod and nothing more. And after the briefing ended, she returned to her quarters and opened a drawer and took out a small leather journal that had belonged to her father. She opened it to the last page, the last entry Jonah Moen had ever written, and she read the words he had put down on the morning of the day he died. The wheat fields are golden today, and Alara is playing in them, and I think this might be the most beautiful place humanity has ever found. I hope she remembers it like this. Alara read the words once, and then she closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer and shut the drawer gently. Her face showed nothing at all, but beneath that nothing, in the place where the 7-year-old girl still sat in the dark, counting seconds, something turned over, something old and patient and very, very awake. It began not with an explosion or a declaration of war or a grand speech broadcast across the galaxy. It began with a supply depot going dark on the far edge of Draylit space, and no one noticed for 3 days. By the time someone noticed, 4 more depots had gone dark, and the communication relays connecting Corvette's outer fleet bases to his central command had stopped working. A Draylit intelligence officer looked at the pattern on his screen and felt his scales shift to a color he had never felt them shift to before, a pale and sickly yellow that his species associated with the fear of being hunted. Operation Long Memory did not look like a war because it was not designed to look like a war. It was designed to look like the ground disappearing beneath your feet 1 centimeter at a time, so slowly that you did not realize you were falling until you looked down and saw nothing. Alara had spent 10 years studying Corvette's power structure the way a surgeon studies a body before cutting. She knew where every vein ran, and where every nerve connected, and where every bone supported weight. And she had designed a campaign that did not attack the body, but simply remove the blood from it, 1 quiet drop at a time. The first phase targeted Corvette's supply lines, human stealth ships, small and fast, and almost invisible to Draylit sensors, slipped through the gaps in patrol routes that Alara had identified years ago, and severed the connections between Corvette's fleet and the resources it needed to operate. And they did it so cleanly that the cuts looked like accidents and malfunctions and bad luck rather than enemy action. The second phase targeted his allies, the warlords and regional commanders and corrupt officials who owed their positions to Corvette's patronage, and who maintained his authority in the sectors where his fleet could not always be present. And one by one, they received visits from human diplomats, who arrived with smiles and files. Thick files full of evidence of every crime and every abuse and every atrocity those warlords had committed under the Warden's protection. And the diplomats gave each warlord the same simple choice: step away from Corvette now and face no consequences, or stay loyal to him and face everything. Most of them stepped away, because loyalty to a powerful patron is easy when the power is certain, and very difficult when the power begins to look like something that might not last. The third phase targeted his reputation. Human intelligence operatives leaked documents to every major information network in the Concord. Documents that showed in precise and undeniable detail what had actually happened at Valen's Reach. Not the official story of human provocation, but the real story of a warden who burned a farming colony because its people dared to resist. And the documents included names and dates and casualty figures and images that the Concord had buried. and never wanted to see in public. The galaxy saw the images of Valen's reach, and the galaxy could not unsee them. And species that had quietly accepted Corvet's authority for centuries began to ask questions they had never asked before. Not because they suddenly cared about humans, but because they suddenly realized that what happened to humans could happen to anyone. Corveth felt his empire dissolving around him, the way a shoreline feels the tide pulling sand away. Slowly at first, and then all at once. And for the first time in his long and terrible career, the Warden was not the one setting the pace of events. He tried to respond the way he always responded, with force, with authority, with the overwhelming power that had always worked before. But his forces were scattered, and his supply lines were cut, and his allies were gone, and every move he made was anticipated and countered before it was even completed, as if the enemy could see his thoughts before he finished thinking them. He could not understand it, and the not understanding made him angry, and the anger made him careless, and the carelessness made him predictable, and that was exactly what Alara had been counting on. She sat in the command center of the Terran flagship and watched the holographic display that showed every fleet movement in real time, and she moved pieces on the board with the calm precision of someone playing a game she had already won. And the officers around her watched her work and said nothing, because there was nothing to say except that they were witnessing something that would be studied in military academies for 1,000 years. The campaign lasted 11 weeks, and in those 11 weeks, humanity did something that no one in the galaxy had thought possible. They dismantled the most feared military authority in Concord history without destroying a single civilian target, without bombarding a single colony, without killing a single person who was not actively trying to kill them first. Every strike was surgical, and every target was military, and every action was proportional, and the message was so clear that even species who did not understand human language could read it. We could do to you what you did to us, and we are choosing not to, and that choice is the difference between us and you. Corvet's fleet was pushed back and pushed back and pushed back again, shrinking with every engagement, losing ships not to destruction, but to surrender, as crews realized that the Warden's cause was lost, and that the humans were offering fair treatment to those who laid down their weapons. And then, on the 78th day of the campaign, Corveth found himself aboard his flagship, with 12 remaining ships, surrounded by a human fleet that outnumbered him 5-1, hanging in orbit above a small green world, where wheat fields had once stretched from horizon to horizon. The world was Valen's reach. Humans had maneuvered the entire campaign, every feint, every strike, every carefully calculated retreat and advance, to bring him here, to this exact place. And Corveth realized it with a cold shock that ran through his body like electricity and turned his scales a color that no one on his bridge had ever seen before. A communication signal cut through the silence on every channel. Open broadcast, unencrypted, meant for everyone in the system and everyone in the galaxy who was listening. And the voice that spoke was calm and clear, and carried the weight of 15 years of silence. "Warden Corveth Son," Alara said, and her voice did not shake, and her words did not rush, and every syllable was placed exactly where it needed to be. 15 years ago you stood above this world, and gave the order that burned it. You walked through its ashes, and called it mercy, and you looked at a child sitting in the ruins, and saw nothing worth remembering. Was deliberate. And in that pause the entire galaxy held its breath. "I was that child," she said, "and I remember everything. I remember the sound of the bunker door closing, and the 2 days of darkness, and the taste of ash in the air when they opened it again. I remember the face of every officer who walked through our home and smiled. I remember my father's name and my uncle's name, and the names of 12,000 people who lived on this world, and the names of those who did not survive your mercy. Another pause, shorter this time, sharper. You are surrounded. Your allies have abandoned you, and your fleet is gone, and the Concord has withdrawn its support. Surrender now, and you will face a trial, a real trial, with evidence and testimony and judgment. Refuse, and you will face us. Her voice dropped to something quieter, something almost gentle, and that gentleness was the most frightening thing anyone on that channel had ever heard. Either way, Warden, this ends where it began. On the bridge of his flagship, Corvette-san stood in the silence that followed and felt something he had not felt in 200 years. Not defeat, because defeat was something that happened to others, but something worse than defeat. Something that cut deeper and hurt more. He felt the understanding, arriving late and terrible and complete, that he had done this to himself. At every cold and patient step that had brought the humans to this moment was a step he had set in motion when he gave the order to burn a wheat field, and that the small creatures he had dismissed and laughed at and stepped over had done nothing more than remember what he had done, and wait until they were strong enough to answer. He looked out the viewport at the green world below, where the wheat was growing again in the places where fire had been, and he looked at the human fleet surrounding him, and he looked at the faces of his own officers, who were already looking at him with the expression of people who knew the end when they saw it. His scales turned a color no one had a name for, something between gray and white, the color of something very old finally understanding how small it had always been. "Stand down," he said, and his voice was quiet and empty and finished. "Open communications. Tell them we surrender." And the warden, who had never been defeated, who had never been wrong, who had strode over worlds and species and civilizations for 200 years without ever looking back, sat down in his chair and said nothing more. And above the world he had burned, the honey badger bared its teeth, not in rage, not in triumph, but in the simple and terrible satisfaction of a creature that had been stepped on and had gotten back up, and had never, not for one single second, forgotten why. The tribunal chamber of the Galactic Concord had never been used for the trial of a warden, because no warden had ever been brought to trial, because the idea of a warden standing in judgment was the kind of thing that most species considered impossible, in the way that gravity was impossible to argue with. It was simply a fact of the universe that wardens judged others and were not judged themselves. Until now, Corvette-san stood in the center of the chamber, in a space marked by a circle of light on the floor, and the light was bright enough to make his scales look flat and dull. And he stood without restraints, because the humans had insisted on it, and the Concord had argued that a Drelith of his size and power should be bound, and the humans had said, "No, let him stand free. Let the galaxy see that we are not afraid of him standing free." And the Concord had agreed, because the humans had a way of making their requests sound like things that were going to happen, whether you agreed or not. The assembly galleries were full. Every species in the Concord had sent observers, and the chamber hummed with the low vibration of hundreds of translation devices working at once, and the air was thick with attention. The kind of focused and breathless attention that only comes when history is being made, and everyone in the room knows it. The human prosecution team presented their case with the precision and patience that the galaxy had learned to associate with everything humanity did since Valen's reach. They laid out evidence in chronological order, clear and simple and devastating, and they named every person who had died on that colony world. All 12,047 names. They read them aloud, one by one, and it took hours, and no one in the chamber moved or spoke or looked away, because the weight of those names pressed down on the room like a hand pressing down on a chest. And even species who had no concept of human grief would have known the weight of that moment, understood that each name was a life that had been ended and could not be started again. They presented the original orders Corvette had signed, and the communications between his officers, and the sensor recordings that showed the bombardment patterns shifting from targeted military strikes to indiscriminate destruction. And they showed the exact moment when the correction became a massacre. The moment when Corvet's anger replaced his judgment. And they marked it with a timestamp that would be remembered for as long as the Concorde existed. Corvet's defense was built on the argument he had used his entire career. That order required force, that humanity had provoked the response through illegal resistance, that pacification was a necessary tool of governance, and that the casualties, while regrettable, were the inevitable cost of maintaining stability in a galaxy of competing species. He spoke these words with the conviction of someone who had believed them for centuries, but his voice was smaller than it used to be, and his scales were a flat and uncertain gray. And the assembly listened to him the way you listen to rain when you are already inside, aware of it, but untouched by it. And then he made the mistake of looking directly at Alara Moen, who sat at the prosecution table with her hands folded and her face calm, and he said the words that the galaxy would never forget. "You must understand, I did what I believed was right, what I believed was necessary for the safety of the Concorde and all the species within it. I have given my life to maintaining order, and I have made difficult choices, and I have carried the weight of those choices for 200 years. Can you not find it in yourself to forgive that?" The chamber went very still, the kind of still that comes before something important. And every being in the room turned to look at Alara. She stood, and the movement was small and unhurried, and she looked across the chamber floor at the warden who had burned her world. And she did not look angry, and she did not look triumphant, and she did not look like someone who had spent 15 years building toward this moment. She looked like someone who was very tired and very awake at the same time. "When I was 7 years old," she said, and her voice was soft enough that the translation devices had to amplify it, which had the effect of making every word feel like it was being spoken directly into every ear in the room. "I sat in a bunker under the ground, while everything I loved burned above me. I listened to silence for 2 days, and in that silence I learned what the universe sounded like when it did not care about you." She paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was the pause of someone choosing their next words the way you choose your steps when walking on the edge of something. "When they pulled me out, one of your officers looked down at me and smiled. Thought it was funny, I think, the idea of a small human child sitting in the ashes of a place that used to be a home. I remember his face, and I remember your face, and I remember every face, and I will remember them for as long as I live." She turned then, away from Corveth, and toward the assembly, and her eyes moved across the gathered representatives of 100 species, and her voice grew stronger, but did not grow louder. "You ask me to forgive," she said, and the word landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into deep water. "But I am not the one you should be asking. You should be asking the 12,000 people whose names we read today. But you cannot ask them because they are gone, and they are never coming back, and no amount of forgiveness can change that." She took a breath that the whole galaxy seemed to take with her. Humanity did not come here for vengeance. If we had wanted vengeance, we had the power to take it, and you all know that we did. We came here so that no warden ever strides over anyone's home again, so that no child ever sits in the dark for 2 days listening to nothing, so that no species ever has to learn the lesson we learned on Valen's Reach. She looked back at Corveth one last time. "If that requires your fear, so be it. We would prefer your respect, but we will settle for your memory, because memory is the only thing that has ever prevented powerful beings from making the same mistake twice." She sat down, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing the Concorde had ever heard. The tribunal deliberated for 9 days, and on the 10th day they delivered their verdict. Corvette San was found guilty of exceeding his authority, of the unlawful destruction of a civilian colony, and of crimes against a member species of the Galactic Concord, and he was sentenced to permanent exile on a barren moon at the edge of charted space, where he would live out the remainder of his days. Centuries-long life, in isolation, watched but untouched, alive but powerless. The Concord had expected the humans to push for execution. Many species would have, and they were confused when the human delegation specifically argued against it, insisted on it even, and the confusion lasted until Saris An explained it to a baffled colleague over drinks that evening. "They do not want him dead," Saris said, and her voice had the quiet weight of someone who had finally understood something that had frightened her for 15 years. "They want him to live with it, to sit on his barren moon and look at the sky and think about what he did and what it cost him for the rest of his very long life. That is the human punishment. Not death, but memory. Not an ending, but an eternity of remembering." Her colleague stared at her and said nothing, and Saris raised her glass and did not drink from it. "They are a terrifying species," she said simply, and that was the end of the years passed, as years do, and the galaxy changed in the way that galaxies change when something fundamental has shifted. Not with a dramatic transformation, but with a slow and steady rewriting of the rules that everyone lived by. The Warden system was abolished and replaced with a council of shared authority, and the Concord adopted new laws that protected minor species from the kind of correction that had destroyed Valen's reach. And humanity grew from a minor curiosity into something that the galaxy treated with careful and genuine respect. And on a bright afternoon on Concord Station, in the courtyard of the human embassy, where flowers from Earth grew in boxes along the windows, and the air smelled like coffee and old books, a young alien child, a small Velithari girl with silver skin and wide, curious eyes, stopped in front of a statue that stood in the center of the courtyard. The statue was made of dark bronze, and it depicted a small, stocky animal with thick fur and sharp claws, and a face that looked like it had never once in its entire life considered the possibility of backing down from anything. The child tugged on her parent's arm and pointed at the statue and asked, "What is that?" A human diplomat was passing by, a woman with gray-streaked hair and calm, dark eyes, and the kind of face that looked like it had seen everything the universe had to offer, and had decided to keep going anyway. And she heard the question, and she stopped, and she knelt down so that she was at the child's level. "That is a honey badger," she said, and her voice was warm and gentle. "It is a very small animal, and it is very stubborn. Bigger animals try to step on it all the time." The child looked at the statue, and then looked at the woman, and asked with the honest curiosity that only children possess, "Does it forgive them?" The woman, Ilara, smiled, and the smile was real, and it was kind, and it carried in it the weight of everything she had lived through and everything she had chosen not to become. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, "he does not forgive, but he does not have to be cruel about it." The child nodded as if this made perfect sense, because to a child it did, and Ilara stood and watched the girl walk away, holding her parent's hand, and disappearing into the crowd of beings from 100 different worlds, all of them walking together under a sky full of stars that belonged to everyone. And somewhere far away, on a barren moon at the edge of charted space, an old Draelith sat alone and looked up at those same stars, and remembered a wheat field, and a child's face, and the sound of his own voice, giving an order that he could never take back. And somewhere in the archives of the Galactic Concord, a clerk made a small update to a file that had not been changed in decades. The entry for species 4417, known as humanity. Origin world designated Earth. Line that read, "Symbolic animal." The clerk deleted the old text and typed new words in its place. Honey badger. Classification upgraded from minor curiosity to apex persistence predator. Addendum: Do not provoke. The clerk saved the file and moved on to the next task, and did not think about it again. But the galaxy remembered. The galaxy always remembered now.